Welcome to Southwest Florida Frontline, the platform where America's first responders, last responders, and military personnel share their stories. This is your platform to share your story, inspire others, and be heard. The views, experiences, and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individual speakers and do not represent the official stance of any affiliated organizations or entities. The information is for general informational purposes only and should not be taken as professional advice. We are committed to maintaining the privacy and confidentiality of all guest speakers and participants and adhere to the highest standards of ethical conduct.
Our guest today is Dr. Belinda Mollard, an expert on recovery missions for POW MIA recoveries and also for humanitarian recoveries. And she has worked for numerous government agencies such as DoD, Forest Service, and U.S. Army, as well as U.S. Navy.
Southwest Florida Frontline, live from the Sunshine State.
Belinda, thank you so very much for being here, for being my first female guest. I feel very honored that it is you, and I look forward to our interview today.
Thank you. I am so honored that I was chosen as your first female guest, so I am excited, and yeah, let's get into it.
Well, since you have been such an amazing female role model to me, since I started working in the US, I wouldn't know who else would be the best first female guest ever. So yeah, do you mind just, introducing yourself, just a brief introduction?
Sure. My name is Belinda Mollard. I am an archaeologist, tribal liaison, forensic scientist, depending on what job I work at the time. But currently, I am a traditional cultures liaison is my actual title. So I am originally from New York. I actually live in the Southwest and have for several years. And I am married and have 2 kids and 2 fur babies. So that's basically me in a nutshell.
Yeah, Belinda and I met when I worked as a contractor for the DoD. And that was a job that has to do with recovery missions. So, I know from back then you have numerous years of experience in recovery work. You just got recruited again for another career step in the recovery world. Would you mind outlining some of the highlights of your career in reference to this specific and unique line of work?
Yeah, I think, and I apologize up front. I had laryngitis last week, so my voice is a little cracking. But I think, for me, it's always been about the work and being able to help people. And I know that kind of sounds weird, but especially when you're doing recovery work, there's families that are waiting for answers and things that you want to be able to do what you can do. But for me, a lot of that has been just the experiences that I've had, the people that I've met, the places that I've been. I mean, when I tell people that I worked in Vanuatu, their first question is where. So these places that I've been and the people that I've met there as well, and the culture that I've experienced that I would not have been able to experience without doing the job that I do. And so I'm thankful for that. And, I hope that in some small way I've been able to help bring closure to some families and just, be able to, and I'm sure we'll get into it, I was an Army brat and I come from a long line of veterans, and I just, know that's something that's very dear to me. But if you've never been in that position and your spouse or your parent or your child is deployed and you're waiting to hear something and then that word never comes, it's devastating. So, to be able to hopefully assist in some of these where people at least get answers, and also on the private side too, not just the military side, but it's just something that I think, is as human beings, we need that closure. And no matter how that closure comes, we need to have some closure. So I think that that's a big part for me, that it's just it's been a wonderful career. It's been difficult at times. It's been stressful. It's been hard, but it's always been rewarding. That's one thing I will say, always been rewarding.
Yeah, and we want to dive deeper later, a little bit more into the rewarding and the wonderful aspects it comes with, but also the difficulties that you just mentioned, because it's a very unique type of culture, that is, doing that kind of work. So just to already touch it a little bit, what were the unique challenges for you during those recovery missions? Just to give you some ideas, I know that you were base camping with military teams. You caught dengue fever on one of those missions. Do you mind sharing a little bit more about those experiences?
Yeah. Base camping is always difficult, although I honestly prefer it. And I know people say what, but I feel like I can control my environment better if I'm base camping, because I know, where I am, my environment, I know what I have. Whereas if you're in a hotel, or if you're in, a hostel or something, it's a lot more difficult to control your environment. So I think that's one of the challenges that I saw, and leading to the dengue fever, that I believe that was a direct response to that. We were in a hotel in Papua New Guinea, and our team leader made a decision without discussing with team leadership, but moved us to another place. And unfortunately, the place was not the best. There was holes in all the screens. There was no windows, things like that. And when you're in an area that's that concentrated with people and with mosquitoes, and you can take all the doxy you want, but when you're in the shower and you're literally covered in mosquitoes, something's going to happen. And so for me, unfortunately, I contracted dengue fever. I also contracted chikungunya on one of my missions. But again, some of the other challenges are more of the personality conflicts, and you may remember we had what we used to call the 21-day salute, and it was usually by about the third week everybody was ready to kill each other, because you're in very close quarters. You're sleeping in hammocks lined up next to each other, or you're in tents right next to each other, so you're with each other 24/7. You're with each other on the site, you're with each other on the dig, you're with each other in the analysis, you're with each other in the at chow time, and you're just ready to kill each other. But you work through those, and you hopefully have a lot of conversations. But I think those are some of the challenges that most people don't think about, is again, those personality conflicts come in. And you gotta be I think you have to be a strong leader to get through some of those things as well, because it's not always cut and dry. There's other things at play, and you got to be able to look at all that as a whole, and the totality of the circumstances, and see how we're going to move forward and get our job done, because that's what we're there to do. Everything else is noise.
I want to pick up on the strong leader that you just mentioned. You have to be a strong leader in order to manage all those situations. You just mentioned that you're in, military bred. Your husband is a veteran. One of your daughters and one son-in-law are veterans. The other son-in-law is active duty. And now there's Belinda being put, as a leader into a military team, very male-dominated military team. I know you are a tough cookie, but, how was that for you? How did you gain their respect? Were there, situations where this was counterproductive, actually, that you were such a strong woman? Because I remember, when we worked on one site together, that especially, the second in charge, the team leader had, the military team leader had problems with you being such a strong woman. And I feel like you can't you can't win. If you're weak, they take advantage of that, and if you're too strong, they complain about that. So how did it work out that you find your place in that specific team situation? And How did you manage to, have a good time and a good outcome of that mission?
Yeah, I on that mission specifically, and just to clarify, it was the team sergeant. The team leader
Oh
was
yeah, yeah,
fantastic.
you're right.
Yeah,
It was the team sergeant. My
the
mistake.
team sergeant was not okay with A, me being a woman, B, me being part of team leadership, and C, me being civilian. There was a lot of animosity. There was a lot of counterproduction. There was a lot of and just a little background for those who are not familiar with the work that we were doing. As the recovery leader, my job, my purview is 100% that dig and that dig schedule. That's me, nobody else. Even though I'm part of team leadership, I'm the one that dictates who digs, when we dig, how we dig, whatever. And so one of the first things, unfortunately, that team sergeant did was change my dig rotation and pull people off of my dig without talking to me, and said that he felt that it was a better course of action. And so, you know, you don't want to come out and just be like, um, balls to the wall, I guess. I don't know if I should say that, but you don't want to. You want to make sure that you're working as a team. And I will say on that particular mission, I always met with my team leaders before. So my team sergeant, my team leader, we always met in advance of the mission so we could get to know each other. I usually went and did PT with the team so that we all kind of had a little bit of a rapport. This particular team sergeant did not meet with us, did not do any PT with us, kind of came into this cold. And yeah, I think it was more, you mentioned like being a military brat. Does that make it easier or harder? I don't know if that really, I think for me, I understand the culture a lot more. I've been there my whole life. And for some folks, they recognize that immediately and they were totally cool with me, or they were very respectful. Where with others, it was the exact opposite. It was a 180. It was like, you're a civilian, why are you here? You're not military, you don't, so in this situation it was very difficult because unfortunately we ended up having a pretty serious injury to one of our crew members on that mission. And a lot of it was this was unfortunately our strongest digger as well, great kid, but he ended up breaking his arm and was out of commission for us. And a lot of it had to do with that kind of these things where this team sergeant took it upon himself to do things that he shouldn't have done. And so we ended up basically, when he didn't show up to work one morning, which is a huge no-no when you're deployed, you don't just not show up. um, he didn't show up, and our team medic ended up coming back and telling me that he was ill. And I said, okay, great, like just make sure he lets us know. We're accountable for everybody. He didn't show up the second day. And then the team leader and I said, okay. So we went and met with him, and I will say had a come to Jesus meeting to just basically lay everything out. And I won't say that it was a, warm and fuzzy after that and everybody was kumbaya, but it did improve drastically. And I think a lot of it was that team leader who was military, was active duty. This specific one was also Army. He was an Army captain. The team sergeant was an Army staff sergeant. I think that helped immensely because when it was just me saying it, he totally disregarded me. And again, maybe because I was a woman, because I was civilian. But once the military team leader, who was also male, kind of put down the hammer and said, look, this is it, and we will go by, uh, the recovery leader's strategy, et cetera. I think that helped immensely. And so it was, it worked out. We had a successful mission. But it's difficult as a recovery leader because, your whole focus is on this mission and on what we need to get done and our strategy and our end of day reports and things like that. And when somebody is coming in and basically sabotaging that, it's hard because we're not, we're not even in that mindset to deal with this person who's being very selfish to the other 27 people that are out on that mission trying to get things done. But sometimes it happens, and you do what you need to do. And like I said, in this case, I had to have the meeting and have the other, have the team leader really stress the importance and kind of just kind of get in his face a little bit. And that was not my choice, but that's how it went down. And after that, I think the respect, I don't know if the respect ever came for me 100%, but the working relationship improved drastically and we were able to complete our mission successfully.
Southwest Florida Frontline, live from the Sunshine State.
Yeah, and just from my own experience, I always felt, once you prove yourself, yes, I am civilian, and yes, I am a woman, but I can equally hard work, and I give all here, like you do. I feel like then the respect comes, and it actually ended up being a very, very great camaraderie at those sites. However, on the civilian part of that specific workplace for DoD, I have not experienced that. I feel like no matter how hard you work, there were always people trying to sabotage, and I don't know, degrade your reputation or something. And what hit me hard is that it was usually women trying to sabotage other women.
Yeah.
So that I, while working for that workplace, actually enjoyed working with the military better than with my civilian counterparts.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, and again, I highlighted that specific mission. I want to clarify, by all means, all of the missions were not like that. I had some amazing colleagues and amazing teams that I worked with, and I am thankful for sure, for all the experiences, the good and the bad. But overwhelmingly, I think most of my experiences, well deployed, were good. But going back to what you just mentioned, yes, when we were back at our base, back where we worked, it was difficult because it was a completely different environment, first of all. And, as archaeologists, we're kind of used to being field personnel anyway. And so it's already kind of a shift for us in culture to be in this very stringent office environment. And I say stringent because it was not a normal office environment, as you probably remember. There was a lot of, people laugh, but there were SOPs, standard operating procedures, that were this thick that everything had to be, including how you dressed, including, not showing a tattoo, including, just things that we think of now as this is crazy. But as you said, we did deal with a lot, which is unfortunate, but a lot of women that were very catty, I guess, they were very almost pitted against each other. And it was difficult as a female to come into an environment where you feel like you've got to wear a suit of armor because somebody's about to put a knife in your back, and it's usually one of your female counterparts. So that was hard. And by all means, never again, that wasn't the first or last time, but it did seem to be very, very normal there in that specific environment, that you did see a lot of women, like I said, either being pitted against each other or just being very catty with each other. And it, for me, I say that all the time. I don't have time for the drama. I don't do that. I come to work. I do my job. I've obviously met some, phenomenal women that I'm still very close with from that position. But there were several that I will never see again, probably never talk to again, and I'm totally okay with that.
But moving away from DoD, your career has spanned across different governmental or government agencies, just to name Forest Service, U.S. Army, U.S. Navy as well. How was it there? Did women support other women there better, or is it a common phenomenon throughout all those government agencies?
I think, I've thought about this recently, and I think that some of it has to do with women as we age. As we get older, we seem to support each other much more than when we're young. So when, certain agencies, I worked for DOI, Department of Interior, and when I came into that office environment was predominantly female in my section, had great working relationships with almost all of those women, and still keep in contact with them today. I also worked with another section in the same office that was predominantly male. And although I had no issues with them, it was a little bit different working with the males in that office, just to try to get like the understanding of like, I'm not here to be your roadblock. I'm just trying to help you. And it honestly, it wasn't because I was a female. I don't think it was specifically my position. It was thought of as a roadblock. And so I had to change that perspective. But I will say in that office, I mean, I had such great relationships with the women I worked with and very supportive. My chief was a woman. My direct supervisor was a male, but again, very supportive, very easy to work with. Most of the other program managers were women. But then again, I've worked for other agencies where, it's not as welcoming. I again usually tended to work in a male dominated field, so sometimes it would be, half and half. Sometimes it would be predominantly male, and you would, if it was more women, which was very rare, sometimes it was not a good working relationship. Like I said, at DOI, I was lucky. I think I had a lot of, or maybe, it's the agency, I don't know, but I had a lot of good relationships. I will say in certain jobs or series in the government, it's more difficult. It depends on, the office you're in, but also depends on what job you're doing at that time. Unfortunately, it is still difficult. And again, sometimes it's a male dominated field that it's difficult working with the men, but it's usually because it's a male dominated field and there's very few women that work in that field. And you would assume, or you would hope, that it would be more of a collaborative environment with the women. And unfortunately, it doesn't end up being that way all the time. Sometimes it is very competitive, and it's very, kind of manipulative. And I feel like as the years have rolled on, I feel like that has gotten better. Maybe it's me because I'm older, or I'm more, open to things, or maybe because my colleagues that are older, we seem to have that much more of a collaborative relationship now than when I was 22, So I hope it's changing, but I don't know. It might just be I'm changing, or as, my colleagues that are around my age are changing. That might be what it is. And maybe the 22-year-olds are still dealing with that. I don't know. Unfortunately, I'm not in that position any longer to be able to say, like, I'm seeing this, because I think as a female, I've always tried to mentor other women. And in the Forest Service, I actually was an officially like a mentor for employees coming in. And I had two women that were in their early 20s, maybe mid 20s, when they came in just a few years within the last few years, and I have, had very good experiences with them. But again, that's more of a mentor-mentee kind of relationship. So, I did hear some stories and some things that make me think that it's still the same. There's still that competitiveness and that manipulation that happens. But I think, unfortunately, and again, I've worked for the government many years, and I'm thankful for my career and for all the things I've been able to do. But I think that is a systemic problem in the government for sure, is that kind of environment.
Do you have any kind of supportive words for young women, entering this line of work or entering a government, into a government position?
Yeah, I mean, I think, be true to yourself, first of all. Come into the job with an awareness like that you don't know everything, especially if you're coming in younger, newer. And I don't mean young, I'm not trying to make it an age thing. If you're new to a position or new to a job or a series in the government, especially, come into it understanding that you don't know everything, and that there are folks ahead of you that you can benefit from. Take in that institutional knowledge and really become the best, whatever it is you're doing. If you're an admin, if you're an HR person, if you're an archaeologist, if you're a biologist, be the best that you can be, but be humble. Open your mind, open your heart, close your mouth, and just be humble and listen, and gain that experience through your colleagues because they've been there and they've done it. And I think that that helps tremendously coming into an environment where, depending on your agency, there are some agencies that are very stringent on procedure and protocol, and this is how we've always done it. And I literally have a sign on my office door that says the most dangerous phrase in the English language is "this is how we've always done it," because I don't like that. I like to be able to have that creativity and be able to try things new. But you also have to understand that sometimes the way we've always done it is there's a reason, it's been tried these other ways. So just be open to that. Be inquisitive of your colleagues and talk to them and get their perspective. And like I said, we've got a lot of institutional knowledge that is leaving the government, either because of retirement or separation or, just done, but that all, you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Like, there's some stuff in there that is very helpful to people coming in, and that understanding, and not even just about your own job, but the system in general. If you want to understand how to retire in 25 years, if you're coming in, talk to somebody about your TSP, talk to people that have been doing this, because it's information that is going to benefit you. So I think that's my biggest nugget for folks is just, be open and listen and talk with your colleagues and get that institutional knowledge before they're gone.
And do you think that those qualities that you just mentioned and mentioned again help you, to navigate the complexities of cultural sensitivity when you talk with the Native American tribes, which is part of your current job?
Yeah,
do you
absolutely.
think that makes you?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, do you think that is an important part of, dealing with the different cultures and maybe, gaining mutual respect?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, me as an anthropologist, I was trained, formally trained in the US as an anthropologist before I went on to get my PhD. So I had that kind of field background already. And I think that helps tremendously, especially when you're working with tribal nations. Having it, our government to government consultations are extremely important, and we are dealing with a nation to nation level. So this is not, that we're having a meeting with a colleague in another state office or a federal agency. This is a nation to nation relationship. And so there's a lot of complexities, and there's a lot of nuances, and there's a lot of cultural differences, even between tribes, but definitely between tribes and the government. So I think that helps tremendously. And again, when I came into this as an archaeologist, I was pretty early in my career. I had a fantastic mentor who unfortunately has passed, but he was just a wonderful person, but a fantastic mentor. And he was the one that actually assigned me my first role as a tribal liaison. And I was, like I said, this kind of young archaeologist, and I'm like, I don't know how to do this, but having that guidance and having that mentorship when I did it, I learned so much. And as I've gone through the years, it has helped me tremendously. I've forged relationships with tribal members who are now elders, that I still have those relationships. I've been invited to ceremonies that normally outsiders are not invited to because of the personal relationships that I've forged. And that, to me, was obviously part of my job doing the tribal consultation, but it was more of a respect and getting to know each other on a personal level that just helped me do my job so much more, and helped that relationship where I didn't, I unfortunately, sometimes you'll find in certain agencies or certain offices that the tribal consultation is a checkbox. Somebody sitting there who's not a tribal specialist will send out a letter and check that box and say, okay, we did tribal consultation. And that's not what it is. And that's never what it should be. So for me, that was always one of the first things I did coming into a new position was reach out and start to form those relationships. And I think that it's very important to have some of those skill sets that I have gleaned over the years to help in that line, because it's not always great conversations. There's a lot of very hard, difficult conversations that have to be had. So I feel like if you've already forged a relationship, those conversations, although still difficult, are much easier to have than if you're coming into a situation full of animosity and you've got to now do this, So yeah, absolutely. I think that's paramount to success in that arena.
And just in comparison to the work situations that we touched earlier, do you think it was easier to form these relationships, or was it even more difficult than the situations we talked about before with becoming part of a military team and working for DoD?
As far as the tribal relations?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Since you're again, you're from a different culture, you're a woman, you're a civilian. So how did this work out? Was it easy or difficult?
I think I don't know. Sometimes it was pretty easy. Other times it was very difficult. And the reason I say that is because some tribes that I've worked with are very matrilineal and very much that women hold positions in the tribe, high positions, chairperson, governor, not an issue. Never had anybody think that, oh, because I'm a female. And honestly, I think, again, if I walked into a meeting saying, oh, I'm the tribal liaison and I'm coming in here to talk to you, whatever, but because I've forged those relationships already, and I think my anthropology background, I've always made a point to understand the culture that I'm going into, whether that be in a tribal meeting or deployed on a mission. It's always been something that I've studied beforehand. I've done that research and I've made sure that I understand the complexities or the formalities or the things that are going to be offensive. You don't want to offend anybody, so you need to understand what that means. And so I think for me, honestly, I've always had very easy relationships with my tribal counterparts. And like I said, it doesn't mean I've always had very easy conversations, because some of those conversations have to be had, but I've always had a very good working relationships, and so much so where a very easy relationship. And I'll give an example. I was taking a group of elders to a site in the Southwest, and this was an Apache group, and so they most of the time, a lot of times, natives will speak in their own language, and it's not meant to be a slight or anything. That's quite normal, and it doesn't offend me at all if somebody's speaking in their native language, even if I don't understand them. But on this specific visit, we had to hike a couple miles in, 2-3 miles in probably. And so as we were hiking, 2 or 3 of the gentlemen were speaking in their native language, and one of them stopped and said, "Did you understand what we said?" And I said, "No, I'm sorry, I didn't." And he said, "Oh, well," and he started to tell me, and then they started to teach me words that like phrases. And I will say I still enjoy thinking about that, because that to me, this was a different group than I'd normally worked with this specific tribe. And although I knew them, I had never spent much time one-on-one with them. And when we were out in the field, I felt like that was, to me, a turning point, because they were sharing things that were not normally shared, I guess. Like they were speaking very, everything was very informal, but they were teaching me like phrases and things that they would say jokingly to each other. And so for me, that was a much more familiar relationship than just that sitting in the meeting in the conference room. And I really enjoyed it. And I think that those were things to me that I guess, validated for me that I was doing it right. Like I wasn't trying to push or press or want to know. And I think we've probably talked about this, where I've been on missions with military members who wanted to know, and like very, very persistent. And I'm trying to, as the cultural liaison, trying to explain to them that that's not how it works in this culture. If you come in trying to push and persist, you're going to get backlash. Like they're going to, and so it's it for me, that's always been the easy part. On a mission, on a DoD mission with the agency we spoke about earlier, I did have a little bit of it was a very weird, I'm very glad that I had the experience, but it was a very weird situation, because when we got to the first day briefing, we often hired locals to help on our digs, as you know. But in this specific country, we had a very small team of our organic team, and then we had all the local villagers. This was the first time in that agency's history, apparently, that we were allowed to base camp with the villagers. And again, it was a logistic thing because it was going to be very expensive and et cetera. So we were base camping with the villagers, and then we went to the site in the morning. When we got to the site the first day, there was a lot of apprehension on the villagers' part. This specific village, it was all men on the site that came to work, and when they would ask, and there was a lot of language barriers, but when they would ask something, my team leader or my team sergeant or one of my crew members would say, "Oh, ask the boss," and point to me. They would not speak with me. And it wasn't that they were being rude or like they didn't respect me. In that culture, they couldn't comprehend that it was a female that was running this whole show. And they didn't, I don't, it was very difficult for them. It was a very machismo kind of society. And so anyway, we had to kind of work around that. And but the interesting thing that for me is that this is what I was seeing while we were on site, and this was very like they're very male dominance, and didn't want to speak with me because I was female, or again because in their culture that's not normal to have this female in this position. But when we would get back at the end of the day and we would go back to the village, I would see a completely different side. I would see that the women would come and hand off a child to one of the men, and the men would then feed the child and play with the children. And I thought, these are the same guys that don't want to talk to me on, so it was, for me, it was a fantastic anthropological experience that I still cherish. But, we worked through that, and toward the end of that mission, it was not an issue. And again, I don't want it to sound like it was a negative from the get-go. It was just a cultural thing. And so by the time we were done, that had changed, and we were definitely a team. But there's that happens with tribal societies all over the world. It's not just in this country. So working with tribal societies in other countries, I found a lot of that as well. And the difference there is I don't have the time leading up to those meetings to form those relationships. So I've got to do it from the get-go. And that's where that anthropological background for me helped immensely. And that pre-research, anytime I would be going to a new country, I would research all that. So at least I understood the basics and could brief my team on what you do, don't do, like absolutely don't do this, or yes, we need to bring a pig to the village because that's the sign of respect. And if we don't, we're going to start off on the wrong foot already. So yes, things like that, when you've got to explain to your commander why you need a pig. So.
Well, it sounds as if it must have been very exciting to learn all, to get to know all those different cultures and see how other cultures live life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. As an anthropologist, we grow up in university, and we read all the early anthropological studies and the ethnographies, and we think, yeah, that's never going to happen. We don't have that anymore. Like, we can't go and work in this. And then for me, that's exactly what I was able to do. And I, again, will never forget these experiences, and I cherish them, and I really do hold them dear, because regardless of if they were good or bad experiences, it's an experience. And that's, for me is priceless.
And I know that my next question is kind of comparing apples with bananas, but can you tell us what was more rewarding, the recovery work or, working with the tribal relations?
Yeah, it really is comparing apples to bananas. I think at the end of the day, for me, it's always the recovery work. Always. Like I said, I cherish
home,
those.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, I cherish those relationships and I cherish those experiences. But yes, at the end of the day, it's bringing somebody home. It's fulfilling a promise we made as a nation, and it's hopefully giving a little bit of closure to a family member. And at this point, it might be a grandchild or a great niece or somebody that's still wanting to know. So I think for me, that recovery work will always be I want to say, I mean, it's all important, but I think that's that's for me is always going to be it. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have done something else very impressive. You rewarded your PhD kind of mid-career, and you went to university in Europe. How was that? I mean, how was it like juggling all those things, having a full-time career, being a mother, a dog mom, a wife, and then also going to university on a different continent? How was that?
Well, I've never done things the easy way.
True.
Even when I was a kid, never. um, but I will say, all of my degrees that I've attained, I've always done while working and while being a mom and being a wife and having my husband deployed somewhere. And so for me, that was not. It wasn't like very strange for me. But I will say that when I got my master's, I was working full time, but I went to university like an hour away, so I could, it wasn't as difficult. The PhD, I don't want to say I underestimated because I didn't. I knew that it was going to be difficult, but when you're in that and you're doing your dissertation and all your research and you're still working 40, 50 hours a week, your life goes away for 4 or 5 years. You don't have like my husband, who is extremely supportive and always has been. I probably didn't see him, for a few years. I mean, maybe passing in the hall. He was so supportive, but it was a lot of times where, we'd get an invite to dinner with friends and I'd say, babe, just go. Like, I can't. I'm sorry. I've got this, whatever. And he would go and tell everybody, sorry, she's not going to make it today. And so there was a lot of, missed dinners and missed outings and a lot of family time that you don't get. Um, Oftentimes one of my dogs would come and lay under my desk just so that I think they could be near me more because it was hard. And then, the travel, because I chose to do this on another continent, that's difficult too. And so, knowing you have to go and at the time that I started that, I was living in Hawaii. So I was traveling from Hawaii to the UK, and that was, again, it's hard, it's expensive, it's difficult to be away, but I always would make sure that my time while I was there was planned out very well, so I got the most out of the library and the research and anything that I needed to do there. My field work was done in the States, in the Southwest, so I was kind of globetrotting for a few years, but I don't recommend it for the faint of heart, but it is something that was a personal goal for me, and a little later than I had initially planned. You're very sweet to say mid-career. I think I'm on the downslide, but but I did want to pursue that, and things in my life that happened earlier precluded me from doing that at that time, which is okay. To me, it means that wasn't meant to be at that time. So it was a little later than I had initially planned, and there was no monetary benefit. There was no work-related benefit to that. It was strictly a personal goal. But it was difficult. It was one of the hardest things I've done, and just to be sitting in that defense and hear them refer to me as doctor at the end of the defense was worth it all. I think just to say, okay, I did it. Like I achieved that goal that I set for myself many years ago. But yeah, it was hard.
And I can relate to that. And honestly, if I would have known what I get myself into, I would have chosen a different career path. However, coming from Europe, for us, it's kind of mandatory having a PhD to even enter any kind of interesting positions. So I didn't really have a choice. But, even though I was younger, didn't do it mid-career, it is hard. And that's why I wanted to ask you, because I cannot even imagine doing this while having a family, having a demanding full-time job, and doing this, especially Hawaii to UK, that's literally on the other half of the continent, so kudos, and, that you
Thank you.
Kudos to you.
Yeah, it
But
was,
I
I
mean,
mean, it's one of those things that you do if you are married, you have kids, you know, you have to have those conversations with your spouse or your partner because it it is going to consume you, as you know.
mm,
So you do need to have those conversations and you have to have a supportive partner. But you know, it by no means is it easy, and it's rewarding in the sense of, again, for me it's a personal goal, but you know, it's different for everybody. So I think it is something that I would say, you know, in my job or my career field, as an archaeologist in this country, most archaeologists, if they're not going to teach at a university, they don't need a PhD and they're not going to get it, just because why, you know, what's the reason behind it? um, we have what's something called the SOI standards, the Secretary of Interior standards, and the minimum of the SOI is a master's degree or higher. But and there's a few other things that I won't get into, but most folks in my field, if they're going to be like a principal investigator, they want to be, you know, they're going to be SOI qualified so they can sign off on other folks' works. That's a master's degree, and so most people stop there. Um, like you were saying, in Europe, it is different, and in a lot of fields, it's different, but for us it really isn't. So I got a lot of questions from colleagues, even like, why are you doing this? You know, why would you bother doing this, and why would you put yourself through this? So I think it's just important to make sure that for everybody, if you choose to go that route, you know, think about it, obviously have the conversations, and then, man, just go for it, because it it is nice to be able to meet your goals. You know, if you set that goal, it's a good feeling when you meet the goal. And then there's kind of that, you know, after, where you're like, now what do I do? But my last 4 or 5 years have been consumed with my PhD research. But yeah, so
yeah, but you said something that is very true. It is, especially not only when you go to university while having a full-time job, but also, or especially when you work in that specific line of work doing recoveries. You know, it is so important to have a support system at home. You
oh
know,
yeah,
either your family or, like you said, a supportive spouse, because it makes it so much easier. Because those jobs are very demanding, not just physically. You have to travel a lot. You know, you need to have a partner or a spouse that is okay with you traveling a lot, but it's also, I feel like, the mental and emotional impact that those, you know, recovery missions or um, uh, those victims that you look for have. So it's
yeah,
good to hear that you had this throughout your whole life, because I couldn't imagine, you know, doing this without having someone, you know, supporting you going through those especially emotional phases that come with doing those cases and that kind of recovery work.
yeah. And I think that, obviously, yeah, that support is paramount. And my husband and my husband is extremely supportive and always has been. And there's things even that you don't think about, like you said, the travel and the, you know, being in another country and flying 17 hours, you know, on a military aircraft that you're literally like, you know, laying on a cold floor, there's no heat, there's no, you know, whatever. So there's those things, there's the physical, you know, when and you know, you've been there, when we're on mission, we don't work 8 to 4. It's like, these are long days, very physically demanding days. And
No
then, you
days
know,
off
no
for
days
10
off, right?
days or
And then you
something.
get back to your base camp, wherever that may be. And although a lot of the crew members are like, okay, now I can just eat and take a shower and relax or whatever, go jump in the ocean if there's no showers, which we've had before too. But for the team leadership, your day is not done. You know, then you've got to do your reports, you've got to do your sit reps, you've got to do, you know, there's so much more, and so you end up being exhausted a lot, like, for, you know. And so when you get back home, you're not just 100% refreshed. You know, you're kind of still coming off of that. And then depending on the work, you know, we've talked about the recovery missions with recovering POW MIAs, but, you know, we also did recovery work for current cases, and those are, you know, those are difficult too. And when you're, you know, you're trying to process this stuff, like, your family has to understand and be supportive, because it's not like you shut that off when you get home. There are things that you see and you do and that nobody can even fathom if they're not in this line of work. And that doesn't just shut off at the end of the day. So it's a whole thing for your family members and your close knit, friends and your network, your tribe, to understand the work that you do. And it's not a normal job, and it's not going to be okay, it's 5 o'clock, let's go, we're going to go out and have a good time tonight and not think about anything else, because it doesn't happen.
And can you share with our audience what this recovery work is that you just got selected to do?
Yeah, so there's this program is actually a joint. I'm not going to say the agencies, but there's I think 3 agencies, maybe 4, but I think there's 3 for sure. I think there's a 4th one that I'm not fully understanding their role yet. But it's a joint agency, and it's basically like a recovery program where certain members it's a very competitive process, actually, but you have to be nominated by somebody, and then you go through a very competitive, rigorous screening and process. And then if you're chosen, then you go through a training by the lead agency. And if you go through all of that, then you still go through another selection process. So gone through all that. I was nominated by a previous supervisor. And the program is,
on that.
Thank you. And the program is actually supporting humanitarian missions around the world. So, right now there's missions that are happening in like the Ukraine and the Gaza Strip and all over the world. And so these are actually supporting the humanitarian aid, like the humanitarian missions. And so some of that, like right now, I'm not poised to be doing any recovery like I did before. It's more of the logistics and the humanitarian part of it. But technically, our mission where we worked were considered humanitarian too. So depending on the mission, and I don't have any specifics right now, but depending on a mission, there could be recovery work, depending on if it's a mass casualty. So some of the folks on this team have worked like during the hurricane relief for this country when we had the hurricanes that just came through Florida and then up the East Coast. But there's also like hurricane and like earthquake disaster areas in other countries that we get called into. So it's a little different. It's not like what I'm used to, but I'm still learning a lot with this, because it's a completely different process and a completely different agency. But so I'm still learning some of the ins and outs of it. But it's exciting, and I'm slated to be gone all of January right now. So we'll see, more to come, I guess. Yeah.
Seems like you can't let go of recoveries, right?
I think it's in it's in you. Like even if you're not actively doing it anymore, you're still tied to the community, or you still do research, or and I know, speaking with you, I know that you are the same, and through your work that you do now. And I think it's once you've done that, I think it is some of the reward of it is there, but also it's that drive to just be able to help, and any way you can. And if it means, reading scans or doing logistics to get people where they need to be, it's all part of the same team, and the work still needs to be done. And that work happens outside of everything else that happens in the world, right? So it doesn't matter what's going on, with politics or whatever at the time, the work still has to be done. So I think a lot of people, that's part of it for us that work in these fields, is that we just want to make sure that the work gets done.
Yeah, it's like you said earlier, it's kind of a big adventure that makes it interesting as well. But then it's also, and it's kind of, I feel like, stimulating on an intellectual level, because it has so many facets. And then you always, have to find your place in a new team. So it's a lot about teamwork, which I appreciate, but it's also very fulfilling and rewarding on an emotional level.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, on a personal level, like, you do feel it.
Southwest Florida Frontline, live from the Sunshine State.
I want to touch a topic that we already touched in the previous interview with Dr. Coyne, Chief Medical Examiner of District 2 here in Tallahassee, Florida. And that has to do with the COVID-19 pandemic and how the world dealt back then with the situation. I want to cite Dr. Coyne, who stated that we were being reactionary. What is your personal opinion on that? Because, I heard rumors that especially government employees back then who were against the vaccination were kind of forced into getting the vaccine because otherwise there would have been repercussions and retaliation. Is that true? I mean, what is your personal opinion about
that? Is 100% true.
COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, that is 100% true. Yes, as government employees, we were actually told, much like the military. So when you join the military, you sign on the bottom line, on the dotted line, right? Like you sign for all this stuff. I think a lot of agencies forget that you, as a civilian, you're not bound by some of those same things. But we were told that you had to have your vaccine and your booster by whatever date, and if you didn't, you would be terminated. And when you think about that, you've got people who have been in this career for 20 plus years and maybe aren't okay with that because, and again, not to get political or anything, but in the medical field, even like, how are we calling this a vaccine? It's not a vaccine, right? Like we're not preventing anything. To me, it's the best comparison would be a flu shot. Like you're getting a flu shot. So you're going to limit your symptoms or lessen your symptoms, but you're not getting a vaccine. And so even how it was rolled out, I think a lot of people already had an issue with that, being told that you have to have this vaccine. It's not truly a vaccine, that there was no testing done or minimal testing, that we normally have a rigorous testing before we do this. And it scared a lot of people. And I personally know people that refused and that were terminated. Now, whether or not those people are now back or that they are in legal action, legal proceedings, I'm not really sure, and I don't know, so I don't want to speak on that. But I do have another colleague that refused and protested and put in a formal protest, and by the time that proceeding was done, the government backtracked on that it was mandatory. So that employee, that colleague, was able to keep their job and did not get the vaccine. But there were many that refused and were just like, on that date, sorry, you're terminated. And I think that's difficult because we are, we're a country that's supposed to have these freedoms that we think we have, and yet, millions of people, whatever, I don't know how many government employees there are, but we're told you don't have the freedom to do this. This is, and I don't want to get way off the track, but it as a woman, it does remind me very much of things where like you don't have autonomy over your own body, and that's hard, because it seems to hit women more. Now, in this case, it wasn't just women, but it does seem to hit women more than men, that we don't have autonomy over our own bodies. We don't have the say-so in these things. So I think that, as far as, being reactionary, as Dr. Coyne stated, yeah, I mean, think about it. Like, when was the last pandemic? When was the last global pandemic that we dealt with on this scale? Like, yes, we've had other things. And I would say, the AIDS pandemic and the, bird flu, I think it was, or swine flu, one of those in the late 90s or early 2000s, but not like this. I mean, this literally shut down the world. And I think the only thing we have to compare this to is like the plague, like what we didn't know what to do. Nobody knew what to do. And everybody wasn't doing the same thing. And so I think that was very evident. And like you said, I went to school in Europe, and I have a lot of friends and colleagues and family even that still live in Europe. And it was treated completely differently. And the procedures and everything was done differently than it was here. And I don't even say here, because in this country, we didn't even do the same thing from state to state. So, we mentioned earlier when you and I were talking about Arizona, like was one of those states that most things didn't shut down, where, in states like New York, that was it, man. Everything was locked down. So I think it was difficult for people because we didn't know what to do and we didn't have a clear path. And I think that, yes, a lot of it was, I'm sure it was reactionary because we didn't know how to be proactive in some of those things. But I think also, there's a lot that we're learning now that, we hindsight's always 2020, right? But if we would have maybe had more information then, would we have done the same thing? And did we have the information? It just wasn't widespread. I don't know. I mean, I can't speak to that, but personally, I've had personal consequences from the pandemic that I, wish I would have had more information at that time. And again, whether or not the information was there, I don't know. But I wish now that I would have had more information because maybe I wouldn't have had some of the things that I do have. But I don't know. I don't know how to reconcile that because I think that I wouldn't think that anything was maliciously done, but I think there was a lot of misinformation or just a lot of unknowns that a lot of people were dealing with. And so, was it something that we just didn't roll out well, or was it really that we just didn't have the information,
Yeah, I still feel like I can't comprehend how all of a sudden there was a momentum and the whole world was enrolled in this. And I mean, it's not just a phenomenon that, happened in Europe or here. It literally happened worldwide with kind of equal consequences. And now, like you said, in hindsight, 4 years after, I mean, we are asking ourselves, were we just blind? Didn't we see all those red flags? Now we have those health-related coincidences that are not a coincidence, and everyone, I think every single one of us is asking themselves, what could we have done better back then?
Yeah.
And I mean,
Yeah,
yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, you having your PhD and having done research and research presentations by yourself, I'm pretty sure that you are kind of up to date with current research on the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's actually it is very scary because we know now that the vaccine had a negative impact, on certain demographics.
Yeah, and I think, and again, I don't know how much you want to get into that, but for me personally, and I know what I've dealt with personally, but to have a doctor tell me, even though I've done a lot of the research on my own, but to have a doctor tell me, yes, like this is what we're seeing, but no doctor is going to talk about that. And no, because we've got this big pharma and this and this, and it's like that actually angered me more than anything, because I thought, we do know, and our medical profession, they do know, but because of the systems we're in and the systems that are in place in this country specifically, and probably in many countries, they're just still not talking about it, or they're still not, I'm just starting to see some studies coming out of some of the consequences that we've known at least 2 years, and I'm just starting to see preliminary kind of studies where very limited data and very preliminary results, but it's like, I guess, I mean, I'm happy I'm seeing a little bit of that now, but when I've had a doctor flat out tell me and then say, but nobody's going to talk about it and nobody's going to go on record with this, is very frustrating. And it really is, it angers me to think that this is our system. This is what we are dealing with, because again, maybe, for some people, it no big deal, nothing happened, they had no consequence and everything was good, and I'll just, suck it up and drive on. Yeah, that's fine for a lot of people, but there's a lot of people that did have consequences and did have things that they're still dealing with or have long lasting or permanent effects from this. either the pandemic, either the virus or the vaccine, or so I think to me it's very disrespectful to just dismiss that, and just say, well, like, oh well, for our I don't know if I want to say our government, but the profession, to dismiss that as that, well, yeah, things happened, okay, move on. No, like it's not that easy. So, and I
And
think
that,
that has soured, or like that has, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist at all. I do enjoy some of them. I find them interesting, or I find them entertaining, but but I think that has fueled more conspiracy theory. And maybe it's not really a conspiracy, but I think that has fueled more thought, or more attention to some of these things, that I feel like if it would have been much more transparent, we wouldn't have had a lot of the conspiracies that are now growing out of that, or a lot of the you know the opinions or the discussions that we're hearing now, that probably wouldn't have been happening if we would have had more transparency early on, and not even at the very beginning, because nobody knew, and I understand that. But a year in, we already had some of these, you know,
yeah,
we
and
already knew.
I don't think this has to do with conspiracy at all, because you, as a researcher and as a scientist, you are trained, to look at the data and to, gain information from it. So it is scary looking at that data, and it definitely fits into exact the same things that Dr. Coyne said, what he's experiencing as a medical examiner. The spikes in death that they have now that they never
Yeah,
had before, and that are, most likely, if not definite, related to the COVID vaccine. However, I also believe that, we were not maliciously exposed to the vaccine.
yeah,
I just hope that, the world learns from that experience, and that, yeah, I mean,
yeah.
unfortunately, we cannot go back in time and change the choices that we made back then. I mean, I am vaccinated as well. That was my only choice, or my only option, that I had to visit my family in Europe.
Yeah. I think, I got the vaccine, I got the booster, and again, and I don't, like you said, I don't think it was a malicious intent. And I think, at the time, that was probably the best information available, we hope.
Yeah.
But I didn't get the second booster. I was like, you know what? No, because I'd already had health consequences, and whether or not that was from the virus or the vaccine, I guess nobody will ever tell me, but I have my own suspicions. And so I did not continue, and I don't continue to do that, because I feel like that at this point, I don't know what's worse, you know? And that's pretty sad to say that, but I went I think the first 2 years, I didn't get COVID. I didn't get my husband and I were very, we socially distanced. We took it very serious, because we didn't know. And I was like, I don't, you never know what's going to happen. And we don't want to be adding to the stress of our medical professionals that are dealing with people that, have, underlying health concerns that are, so anyway, we didn't in the first couple of years, but that was when we started to do the vaccine, and then the booster, I think, was in that second year, the 2021, I think it was. And like, that's when we started having issues, including that I actually got the booster and within 2 weeks had COVID, which, coincidence, I guess, right? But now, some of those things are like, oh, well, if you got the booster and then you got the virus, now we're seeing a problem with that. And it's like, well, great. So, again, it's hindsight's always 2020, but I think that there was a lot of things that happened with that, again, like you said, I hope that going forward, if we ever have something like this again, we've learned from it, and we understand a little better, and that we get more transparency from the beginning. I think, again, not to get too far off of that, but I find nowadays, if you turn on the History Channel, you're going to get a lot of Bigfoot, or, conspiracy stuff or whatever. You don't really get a lot of history anymore. But I do find it interesting sometimes, if I just want something on in the background and I turn one of those on, and I have heard things like that, that, at the time things happened, and I'll use it for instance, the Roswell incident. At the time something like that happened, the general public wasn't ready. That would have caused mass hysteria, blah, blah, blah. So the government chose to only release certain details or whatever. But I always feel like, again, you might say that, but I think that you're not giving enough credit to people. So when this pandemic hit, I feel like we were almost Roswelled, like, oh, it's going to cause mass hysteria. We don't want to tell people. We're just going to, and I think that's where you need to have some respect for people and allow people to make their own choices based on actual information and put the information out there. And like you said, as researchers, as scientists, we're trained to do that. We're going to do that. We're going to research everything. I mean, I don't pick a color on my walls in my house unless I've researched to see which one I want and what it's going to look like and how the lighting is going to hit it. I understand that everybody doesn't do that. Everybody's not a born researcher or a trained researcher that's going to look at all these things. But I feel like we still owe people the transparency to give them the choice to do that. And if they choose not to, okay. But if you choose to, then that's something that I think should be respected, that you've made a choice based on your research and not just doing something because you're mandated to do it, or you're told that you have to, or that everybody else is doing it. So I do feel like if we ever have something like this again, I hope we've learned enough to say, let people make their decisions, give them the information and let them make an educated decision and not be forced to do something that they may not be comfortable with.
You mentioned earlier that it was kind of like a state-to-state decision how they deal with the pandemic, social distancing, and all those, mandatory precautious measures were different and varied from state to state. I just know that certain countries in Europe, like my home country, Germany, were very strict. People literally died alone in the hospital because family members were not allowed to visit. You were not allowed to have any friends over. That had a huge, especially emotional and mental toll on people. And it seems as if this really changed people and their mindset forever. So people are changed back there in Germany. And here in Florida, where I live, that we were not very strict with many of those, measures, which I personally appreciated a lot. But that, the flip side was that a lot of people moved down here, which then also changed Florida forever. So I feel like we have a Florida pre-pandemic and we have a Florida post-pandemic. So how did you experience this in Texas, where you live?
Yeah, 100%. We have a Texas pre-pandemic and a Texas post-pandemic for sure. We had a lot of people, and it was already, to be fair, there was already some movement before the pandemic, because Texas is one of those states where we don't have an income, like we don't have a state income tax, but our property taxes are usually higher. So there was already people moving to Texas, like a lot of people will retire in states that don't have an income tax. So there's always been that kind of movement. But honestly, probably right before the pandemic, Texas, as the government of Texas, was trying to entice businesses. So they did some tax deals to have businesses come here. So Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, in particular, got a lot of influx of businesses just prior to the pandemic. But then during the pandemic, we saw a lot of influx, and we saw a lot of movement just post-pandemic of people coming to Texas. Now, whether that be the tax situation, the weather, whatever it is, it's definitely changed Texas. And then for me, it's even more stark because I live in the very furthest west part of Texas you can get, literally, like the very first, city coming in on I-10. And so we are 8 hours drive to the nearest next city in Texas. So we almost are kind of like not part of Texas, but we are part of Texas. So we've seen even more stark differences because of how, we still pay our taxes and we still have our very high property taxes and things like that. And although we didn't see the same influx that Austin saw, we're getting taxed on what's going on in Austin. So we're seeing huge differences in like our cost of living, our what our houses are costing, and we don't have the industry here to support that. But yet we have to pay the taxes of what's going on in Austin and Dallas and Fort Worth. So we're definitely seeing it, and it's Texas is a little different anyway. It's not, it's a different culture here to begin with. And then it depends on what part of Texas you're in, so like, for instance, we're going to go visit one of our daughters on the East Coast for Christmas, and we're driving. We will literally drive 12 hours the first day, and we are still in Texas. We won't leave Texas. We'll still be in Texas. So clearly we're not all the same in Texas, but we're definitely seeing a lot of changes post-pandemic here that we didn't expect and that we weren't really prepared for, and that we're now trying to catch up on, so I think a lot of states have seen that, and a lot of states have seen the flip of that. They've seen a lot of people depart, so that's affected their tax base and their population too. So yeah, I think when you say like it's forever changed us, we still have that tail of what's happening now that is directly related to the pandemic, and not the health relation, just again, there was a lot of digital nomads, people that went remote, and their companies decided to keep them remote. Well, now we're seeing 4 years later that companies are calling people back. Well, if you sold your house and moved across the country because you thought you had a remote job, and now they're like, yeah, you got to come back, that's affecting people too. So there's a lot more to this than just the health issues. We're definitely seeing a lot of tail, things that are still happening on that tail of the pandemic and what happened in 2020, maybe even into 2021, that we're now just seeing some of the results, or like I said, we're dealing with the movement of a lot of people, and a lot of offices that shut down and, like I said, went remote or whatever, and now they're like, okay, yeah, now we need everybody back. And so I think we're not done. We're gonna deal with this a few more years, and maybe even longer. But I don't know, and some things are probably good and some things are not. But I think a lot of it, like you said, that the culture of the areas that we lived in, for you, for Florida, for me being in Texas, it's changed for sure. And that's not going to go back. It's not, that's a new reality.
It seems as if this tale that you were just describing has had a similar impact on the original inhabitants from Texas, people who live in Texas pre-pandemic, like here in Florida, because we also had all those people moving down here from the northeastern states, mainly coming down here with their high salaries, completely destroying our economy, and well, long story short, leading to a house market or a crisis on the house market, forcing people who have been living here for decades getting or receiving Florida salary out of their homes and out of their positions. So it's a very bad impact that this had here on our local economy and housing situation, and we are still trying to recover from that, because we had our Florida salaries while those people came down here with their big northeastern salaries, and that definitely changed the housing market and everything else. Very interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that again, for Texas, that was definitely something that happened. We had a lot of West Coasters that moved to Texas. But like I said, I think what's difficult for me is that because Texas is so large, there are a lot of places in Texas that, like you said, our salaries are still that old Texas salary. We're not going to get a California salary or an Oregon salary or a Washington state, we're not going to get that. And our taxes, our property taxes, have gone so high that it's creating a crisis where people are losing their homes because they can't afford their taxes anymore. And it's sad to see that, because I think there's got to be some kind of solution, and I'm originally from New York, so we complained about this 20, 30 years ago, that, the rest of the state has to support New York City. Like, we got to have some kind of, there's got to be something that these state lawmakers need to understand, that this, the state Congresses need to get, that everybody can't pay to support these big hubs that are getting all this influx of people and salaries and everything else. It's got to be, there's got to be some kind of, balance. And when you're paying the property taxes that I'm paying, and my children are grown, of course, but there's not even a park for the kids to go to. Like, how do you justify raising people's taxes and they're not getting the services? There's no recreation centers for these kids to go to. There's no, I mean, obviously there's a few, but you know what I mean? Like, there's not a lot of parks, there's not a lot of green space. And our taxes keep raising. Our emergency services are not keeping up with that. So it's difficult for people, especially long-term residents of a state, that are paying so much more than they've ever paid, and like I said, losing their houses in some instances and not seeing any benefit come from that, because they're not in one of those hubs that are getting all the bling and the money and the the people. And so I think that's definitely a cost that a lot of us are paying post-pandemic. And again, I don't know what the answer is, but I don't know. Hopefully there's some light at the end of the tunnel and it's not an oncoming train, I hope.
Yeah, and here in Florida, we have the hurricanes on top of that, who are, making the problem even way bigger. So
Yeah.
I have no solution for that right now either, but I hope that, I don't know, hopefully in the future, things might go back to normal, how it was pre-pandemic wise.
I think you're much more optimistic than I am, but
Southwest Florida Frontline, live from the Sunshine State.
So you're a New Yorker in Texas.
I am.
Two complete opposite on the spectrum of Americans, right? So
Absolutely.
what would you say is what is the typical Texan? What is the typical New Yorker? And how does a New Yorker, live in Texas?
That's a good question. I will preface by saying we've lived in Texas twice, and we've lived here a long time. So, and we didn't come directly from New York.
So you're a Texan by choice.
Oh, no. I'm not a Texan. I will always be a New Yorker. However, one of my children thinks she's a Texan, and she will tell people she's a Texan. And that's because she was basically raised.
The German
This
child?
is the German, yes, the German that's a Texan now. Yeah. She was basically raised in Texas, so she feels that she's a Texan, but like she wears cowboy boots, But she, it's hugely different. And so much so that, my husband and I love New York. We love where we're from. But we have changed. New York has changed. Texas has changed. And I think, we talk about that a lot. Like, it's not the same as it was when we were growing up, but we will always be, my husband and I will always be New Yorkers. We feel like we are definitely, like, we've never lost our connection to back home. Even living in Europe, and when we lived in Germany, like, back then there was no internet, there was no cell phones, texting, nothing, and we always maintained our connection.
And I also forgot to mention that you're actually Italian.
Yeah.
Right? And
yeah, can you tell by the mouth? Yeah. And I think that that's funny, because I think when even some of the things we talked about earlier, being a woman, being female in certain jobs or certain fields, I think throw in that, and it's not, I don't want to be stereotypical, but I think as a New Yorker, I did learn coming when the first time I moved to the Southwest, I am very direct, and I always have been, and that's probably because of my heritage and my home state, and it's not a rude thing. At least I don't mean it to be. I hope it's not. But I'm very direct, and I will tell people what I think, because to me, I'm like, why waste time beating around the bush? Just say what you want to say. Like, and I appreciate being told directly what somebody wants, or I feel like there's way too much, confusion sometimes if people are trying to be, soft touch around people. It's like, just say what you want to say, like, But coming to the Southwest initially, and we initially moved here, the first time we moved from Colorado. And Colorado was a little different too, but a little bit more of a mix because we lived in Denver. So it was a little bit more metropolitan and we had a lot of people from elsewhere. But we moved to Texas the first time, and I found that very quickly. Um, so much so that I had a supervisor who was female that told me that if I was in a meeting and I said the exact same thing as my male counterpart, that I would be considered aggressive while he would be considered assertive. And that blew my mind. I mean, this was coming from a female in a position of, a supervisory position. And I said, what are you talking about? Like, why would you even say that? And she said, well, let's face it. You live in a state that is very, in some respects, very traditional. The culture here is completely different because not only where I live in Texas, we have a lot of Mexican influence as well, and from Mexico, like a lot of Mexican influence. And she basically told me, like, you will be considered aggressive. You will be seen as aggressive. You will be, and I was like, so those were things that I had to learn early on, that not that I needed to change who I am, because I am who I am, but I needed to be cognizant of how I interacted with colleagues, with, friends here, with, just social interactions on a daily basis, because it's not New York. And I think people have a different, like, people think that all New Yorkers, like, we just put our heads down and we're rude and we don't want to talk to anybody. And that's not what it is. I think, we're usually in a hurry. We have a place to be. We have something to get done, but it's a different culture there. Like, we differ in how we interact with people as well. And so here it's very different in the sense of, like, there's something that is referred to, especially in West Texas where I live, it's referred to as mañana time. And it just means, like, I'll get there when I get there, like tomorrow, whatever, I'll do it tomorrow. I'm not worried about it, where as a New Yorker growing up, it was like, no, this has to be done. This is, and then living in Germany, like, oh no, there's a time frame and we have to get this, so there's things like that you need to learn when you live here. And I've lived here long enough where I think, I get it for the most part. I still sometimes I'm like, oh, I can't, I know. Like, I joke with a friend of mine who is from Mexico, and when she tells me, like, we're gonna meet for dinner at like 6, I tell her, so should she be there by 7? Because she's not gonna be there at 6. But it's fine. It's like things like that where we're, socially there's a lot of that kind of stuff that you just get it after a while, and you understand it and you don't get upset about it, because it's a cultural thing here. It's not everybody is really on the time that they're on, and they're not bound by the clock. Now, work is a little different because, of course, if you have a meeting at 9, you got to be in your meeting at 9. But it's different. I think, though, for me, I will say I enjoy where I live. I enjoy the cultural interactions that I get to have because of where I live, but I also enjoy the weather. I mean, it's not extremely, it's hot, but it's not, I do live in the desert. And again, that's the other part of Texas. It's not like the rest of Texas. But I do enjoy the desert, and being a Southwestern archaeologist by trade, I love it. But I think that, there are a lot of differences, and there's a lot of things that will never reconcile, but that's okay. I don't deal with hurricanes. I don't deal with, avalanches anymore. When I lived in Colorado, there were avalanches a lot. I don't deal with blizzards and lake effect snow, although I love seeing it on TV. I don't have to shovel my walk, So I think that there's things that I enjoy about where I live now, but I'll always be a New Yorker. And apparently, again, that's a thing. My daughter, my youngest that you mentioned, was born in Germany, and she was an Army brat, so she was all over. Both of my kids were all over the place. But we settled in Texas the first time when she was pretty young, and she went to school here. Both of my kids graduated from high school in Texas, so they both have a fondness for Texas, and I think for them this is home. And so I find that interesting as a parent, that, and especially coming from, an Italian family in New York that was very close growing up, that I still feel that bond with my cousins back in New York. I still feel that bond with New York. I still, like, when I go home, I have a list of stuff that I'm going to eat, and, where I'm going to go. And I find it interesting, and it's, it brings me back a little nostalgia when I see my kids, because when they do the same thing when they come to Texas. And so it's we've come full circle where my kids are Texans that belong to New Yorkers, I guess.
Well, you know that I personally really appreciate you being straightforward, because that is very close to where I'm from culture-wise. And this reminded me of a story that happened while we both worked for DoD, for the POW MIA recovery missions. The example that you shared about assertiveness versus becoming coming off as aggressive. I remember that I was peer reviewing one of the reports, the anthropological reports of one of my co-worker, and I heard that he complained about my comment in regards to the peer review. And I thought, you know what, I just go over into his office and we just straighten it out. I didn't mean it in a rude way. I actually thought that's forthcoming. It's, very effective. It's saving us time. And we can do that in a very kind and professional manner. So I walk over, knock on his door. He asked me in, and I just asked him, what the problem is in a very professional manner. And he answered, and I thought we straightened it out. So I go back to my office, and just a little while later, I get an email from my male supervisor telling me that I came off very aggressive and that I should not have done this. And for the future, he recommends that I, stop doing that and calling people out on their mistakes. And that to me was a cultural, I think, a good cultural lesson that I learned, that my intention was completely different from how it was received. And I also believe that because I was a woman, it came off as being aggressive, versus if I would have been a male colleague or coworker, they probably would have just, received as a normal, assertive conversation or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't even know if you would have been considered assertive if you were a male.
Correct.
It's almost like there's a lot of that a female questions something that, there's a whole different connotation than if a male does it. And I hate to say that, because I I feel like, have we not come any further from when I started this? And in some respects we have, but I do feel like there's still a lot of people that feel that way. And like I said, even just to have a female supervisor tell you that blew my mind, because I thought, man, you would think that she'd be trying to encourage and build up strong women in the workplace, but that's not always what happens. And yeah, I think, like you said, I feel like there's a lot of that still happens. There's a lot of things. Part of my job that I do now is equity work and environmental justice, and I still, some of the stories that I get, I'm just especially on the equity front, are we still doing this? It's 2024. When is this going to stop? But it does still happen, and unfortunately, all we can do is keep being vocal, I think. And I always feel like it's not my problem. I think there's a quote that went around for a while, and it said something like, did I offend you, or are you offended? Because there's a difference, and it's it's not necessarily what I'm saying, it's how you're perceiving it. So I feel like a lot of times too, I have to check myself in that way too, to make sure, am I receiving this the way they are intending it, or is it, and again, me being very direct, I'm going to go ask, but that's not everybody. And I think the more that we see as the workforce changes again, because I think now is the first time we've had 5 generations in the workplace. It's definitely apparent that we generationally we approach things differently too. So that's another thing that we're now understanding and trying to maneuver in the workplace, is how are we receiving and giving information generationally, and is it being accepted or received the same way that we think as one generation to another generation? And the answer is no. And so we're trying to figure that out too. So yeah, a lot of complexities in the workplace, and unfortunately, being women doesn't make it any easier.
Yeah, I agree.
Southwest Florida Frontline, live from the Sunshine State.
So we have this category for our podcast. You can't make this stuff up. Do you have any situation or any case, any mission, anything that fits into that category that you do not mind sharing with our audience?
Yeah, I thought about that, and I think there's probably a few. I will say one, and I don't mean to be disrespectful to our law enforcement partners in any way, but I will say that there was one recovery that I was on, and this was a current case, and I mean a contemporary case. It was not a historic case, and I was called out. Myself and another forensic anthropologist were called out to excavate. Um, I don't know how much I should say, but basically excavate a shallow grave and assist law enforcement officers in recovering remains. So we went out, and the other anthropologist and I were assessing and doing some preliminary things, and we had two younger officers out there with us, and I think what sticks in my mind is, and I always say this, like, oh my gosh, you can't make this up. We're out there, and I don't know what their normal jobs were. I don't know if they were just put on there for that day that we happened to be there, but they were discussing things with us and talking, and they were like, yeah, we can't find, XYZ, and talking about specific body parts and things that they were saying. And my colleague and I are looking at each other, and we're looking back at them, and we're like, right there. And we're like having to point out that these two officers had no idea what they were looking at, what they were seeing, how extensive this was, and not even extensive, but um, as a crime scene investigator, there are certain things there's procedures that you need to be able to do, and none of these were being done, and we were having to point out that this was very meticulous, and this was how this was, you have to cordon this off, and you have to do that, and so it was just I think, and again, because of the nature of that case, it was already a difficult case. But for me, that's one of those, like, you can't make this up thing, because I'm like, these were the two officers that were put on this case, or at least that were there that day. And I don't know if they'd ever seen anything or done anything. Like, I don't know where they came from, but they had minimal experience, at least in that arena. And I just feel like, man, these poor kids. That's all I could think
Well,
in
I
my
just,
head was.
if this was a criminal case, I just hope that they didn't compromise any evidence by,
Well, that was
not following a chain of, um, evidence and everything.
yeah, that was our biggest thing, was that there's a whole lot here that has to be done that we're
Mm-hmm.
not seeing. So we basically had to take over that part of the investigation and call more folks out. And I don't want to diss our law enforcement. They do phenomenal work. But it's one of those things where you get into these places, and that, unfortunately, that's not the only time that I've had where like the procedures weren't followed well, or things weren't cordoned off properly, or there was as when you're on a crime scene, you get one entrance, one exit to the crime scene, where we had multiple exit points, and I'm like, no, you can't do that, and like you said, chain of custody, chain of evidence, these things cannot be compromised. So thankfully we were able to take hold of that very quickly from the time we stepped on site. But that's just, to me, those are some of those things where you just think, like, you can't make it up. Like, why would that even happen? And shouldn't, like, this is not, when we were called out, the case was already known what it was, right? It's not like we just stumbled upon this. Like, we were called out for a specific reason. And so I feel like, yeah, there's a lot of those instances. Another one is people, as archaeologists, people always ask you, what's the coolest thing you've ever found? And, like, I don't know, I never know how to answer that, because what I think is cool might not be what somebody else thinks is cool. But I was, for any archaeologists out there, I was on a survey, which is a pedestrian survey. You're walking, you're out, looking on the ground, whatever. And this almost never happens. People think it does, but it never does. The first thing I found was a whole pot intact. which never happens, and especially not on a survey. It doesn't happen in digs, but that never happens on a survey. And the second thing on the same project was I found a full intact burial
Oh,
while I was
wow.
pedestrian surveying. So to me, those are kind of those you can't make this up, because like that never happens. And so much so that my field supervisor at the time, my field director, didn't believe me. So he was like, "Yeah, no, you didn't." And I'm like, "No, I did really, you know." And then I think the only other thing and I know these are probably more than, is that I was surveying this was many years ago, but when you work for certain agencies, there are times there are no days off, you know. There are certain times that you have to do things. So this particular year was Christmas Day. We had to go out and do the work because it was the only day of the year that we had to go on an active range, and it was the only day of the year that the range was closed. So we had to go out on Christmas Day. So Christmas morning, my kids were up early, obviously, and they were young. Did the whole Christmas, open the presents, and then I got to work, you know, and then we'll come back and do dinner. So we were out there working on Christmas morning, and we're surveying, and all of a sudden one of my colleagues said, "What was that?" And I was like, you know, we're not really paying attention. We're paying attention to our work, but I'm like, "What do you mean?" You know? And then we hear a very distinct, like, and I'm like, and I just, you know, I got on the radio, because we're all spread apart. We're not next to each other. I mean, this colleague happened to be fairly close. I get on the radio and start yelling to everybody to hit the ground. And we're on the radio with range control, trying to figure out what's happening as we're being shot at on the range on Christmas
Oh my
morning.
God.
So that was probably my
With
big
two
one.
little kids at home
you
waiting
can't
for mommy to come
Yeah,
back
and mom's
alive.
getting shot at on a range, and so we're trying to figure
Oh
out
my
what
God.
the heck is going on, and we're on the radios, and we're trying to get range control, and we're on, you know, with the military police, like, what is happening? What, you know, like, somebody's gonna die. We're out here, you know. And long story short, there was an international exercise going on, and there was another country's unit was here for the exercise, and they took it upon themselves, thinking, well, it's Christmas, nobody's going to be out there. They never checked in with range, and they went out to do some
Oh my God.
target, you know, some shooting on the range that morning, and we were out there working. So that's probably my biggest one, is you can't make this up, because I mean, could you imagine what would have happened if anybody would have been killed? But it's one of those
So
things
no one
where it's
got
like,
hurt, nothing?
no,
Everyone had a guardian angel?
thankfully, it was Christmas, and that's the only thing I can say, was that there had to have been some Christmas magic happening, because unbelievably nobody was hurt, and you know, range control was able to get them, you know, stopped and fairly quickly. But that's one of those things where you think, and then that's why, to me, this is probably my biggest, you can't make this stuff up, because there are so many protocols in place on an active installation that this should never be in the realm of a possibility of happening, and yet it did. So, you know, you always have to have your head on a swivel. You always have to be aware of your surroundings, and that's not just at work. I mean, that's to me, that's everywhere. You know, raising daughters, I've always told them that, like, don't be, you know, looking at your phone when you're walking to your car at night or whatever. Like, you got to be present. You got to be cognizant of what's happening around you. But I think that, to me, is my biggest one. It's like, you know, with all the protocols and safety procedures and SOPs in place, and this still happens. So, you know, just make sure you're aware of your surroundings, and that you are listening, and like I said, that head on a swivel to see what's going on all around you, because you never know when somebody's going to shoot at you on Christmas morning.
Did they eventually saw you, or did your group started screaming, or how did
I think
this?
and again, a couple of us were on the radio with the different things, but I think one of the folks that was kind of toward the end, so they weren't really in the line of firing, stood up and was like waving, and I think that's what initially stopped them, and then range control was able to get there and get them, you know, locked down pretty quickly. But yeah, it's just one of those things where you're just like, you know, how do you tell somebody that their archaeologist mom was shot on a range? Like, you know, it's just crazy that this stuff happens, but it does. So, you know. But yeah, I think that I don't have a whole lot of really cool things. I mean, I probably do, but I probably don't think they're that cool. So I don't know.
Well, I feel
But
like nothing
that's my big one.
nothing can the last story was just nothing can top that one, you know.
Yeah, and thankfully we're all still alive and kicking, and The archaeological community is very small. I know people laugh about that, but we literally, I think we all know each other. I swear, you'll be at a conference and you'll run into somebody that you went to graduate school with or something. But I am happy to report that everybody that was on site that day is still alive, kicking, and still out there doing archaeology. So we're all good.
Thank you so very much. This was so great, so inspiring. Do you have any last words for future, especially female archaeologists, anyone who want to follow in your footsteps?
I would say, first of all, thank you very much. I immensely enjoyed this. I always enjoy talking to you, so you know that. But I would say that for me, coming, like I said, I'm kind of on the downslide toward the end of my career, I think. But I always tell people, I love my job. I love being an archaeologist. I love the jobs that I've held, the positions, the places I've been. I do, usually when I teach courses or guest lecture, and those questions come up, I always tell people it's not all Indiana Jones. We wish it was. It's not. It's a lot of paperwork. It's a lot of time in the office, and it's a lot of research. But my biggest piece of advice is that it's a labor of love. So if you don't absolutely love this job, you are not going to be rich being an archaeologist. You are not going to be famous being an archaeologist. That happens very far and few between, and probably no longer because everything's already been found. But it is a labor of love, and it's something that you have to really want to do. And I think that's not just with archaeology. If we talked about this briefly, you and I earlier, that if you don't love your job, if you don't love going to work, you're going to have a long career ahead of you. So to me, it's like if you enjoy doing it and you love the work, that's what you need to focus on and make sure that that's the path you're on. Because if you absolutely hate field work, if you don't like working outside, if you don't like being in, extreme temperatures or rugged terrain, this isn't the job for you. And that's okay. There are other things to do with an anthropology degree or an archaeology degree, but make sure that it's what you want to do, because there's nothing worse than spending 30 years in a career you don't like. So, and I think that, again, is not just for archaeology, but for anybody coming into the workforce. Make sure that you're enjoying what you do and be the best that you can be. And so for females coming in, understand that there may be things that are unfair that happen, and it's not okay, but it's also something that we deal with it, and it's something that you have to get over sometimes, because and I don't mean to be blasé about it. I don't mean that you should be treated unfairly. That's not at all what I'm saying, but there are some things that are perceived differently, like we talked about assertiveness versus aggressiveness with men and women, and it's just something that you're going to have to deal with, but get to understand and understand how others are perceiving and reacting. So you're not in a bubble, and you need to understand that when you're working with other people, to just be cognizant of that. And if that means you have to change the way you do something, it doesn't mean you're changing yourself. It just means that there might be a reason that this is being perceived in a way that is unfavorable or not what you intended. So check yourself every now and then, make sure that you're still saying and doing the things that you're meaning to say and do, and that it's being perceived that way, and do that kind of, pulse, get that pulse check every now and then, and make sure so that you don't run into situations that become huge and you can't, you can no longer deal with. So I think that's my biggest piece of advice is love what you do. Make sure you get that pulse, you keep checking the pulse every now and then just, have fun. You only get one life, so make sure you live it and do what you love to do.
Very warm and wise closing words. Thank you so very much for being here.
Thank you.
Your story matters. Reach out to us at SWFLfrontline@gmail.com. Follow us on Instagram, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music under @SWFL Frontline.